Hello and welcome back to another episode of the ShefF1 Podcast. We've just had the Japanese Grand Prix weekend finish, and we're going to be doing some reactions to our predictions and just what happened across the whole weekend. It was an okay race. Like, it was, again, much like Australia, nothing, it wasn't box office, but there were lots of overtaking moves, especially considering how difficult it is to overtake around Japan. And yeah, it was a pretty, I don't know, there was a lot of anticipation going into this weekend. Seb, would you say that it under-delivered a little bit? Not to just throw you right into the deep end at the start of the show, but, we had high hopes going into Suzuka, and were you as entertained as you thought you might have been?
I was probably about as entertained as I thought I would be, but I still wasn't that entertained. I didn't have that high expectations going into it, but I've seen everyone online has sort of been saying that, yeah, it was a really good race, but I think it wasn't really. I think people saying it's a good race shows the state of F1 at the moment, that we're so desperate for any sort of story in a race that, Yuki Tsunoda finishing P10 is like all of a sudden this really big news, when it's like that shouldn't be the main story. But it was okay. I guess it could have been worse. We know it's a really hard to overtake track, and there could have been no overtakes and it would have been incredibly boring. But thanks to all the different strategies on show, yeah, it was watchable. I'll say that. I didn't regret getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning for it.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you watched the WrestleMania this weekend, it might have been a nice little all-nighter of sport. But I don't know, Suzuka has delivered better in the past, but like I said, there were a lot of overtaking opportunities, and yeah, a good drive for the man on home soil, Yuki Tsunoda. I mean, you say that it's a little bit embarrassing how that was one of the main talking points leaving the weekend, the battle for 10th, but you know what, there were a lot of cars in the running for that. I mean, Tsunoda, I think, deserved that point, most definitely. It was just a drive flawlessly driven by Tsunoda, didn't really put a foot wrong anywhere, good pace throughout. And of course, he was the reason why his teammate didn't make it into Q3. We'll talk a bit more about Daniel Ricciardo in due course. But, there was, Valtteri Bottas, if it wasn't for staking their terrible pit stops this year, then we could have seen maybe a bit more of a fight for 10th place. And you could argue as well, Logan Sargeant had some decent pace, but again, it all just sort of crumbled in front of him, and I think it would be a bit, optimistic seeing Logan Sargeant, or arguing a case for Logan Sargeant in the points. You know what, I did touch on him briefly just then, but Amy, let's talk about Daniel Ricciardo, because of course, he got tangled up in an instant on the first lap after the first couple of corners. Just talk us through what happened there.
Yeah, he was ahead of Albon, and he had plenty of room, I think, on the left side, and he didn't. Albon just went into the back, and then it obviously both collided out on lap one, and yeah, it weren't good. I think it's arguable that, Daniel couldn't have avoided it, but I don't know, I think there was a lot of room, but I'm not going to blame him completely, but he has a lot to prove, and I thought it was brilliant from the cameras this weekend that Liam Lawson was behind him in every shot.
It was directed, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It meant for Lawson to be there.
Yeah, it definitely weren't the best incident for him this weekend, especially after being given this ultimatum by Helmut Marko, but I think he shouldn't take it too much to heart. I think he's obviously going to be given a few more races to show what he can do in that car, but for Yuki to go and get P10 again and get points, it's going to be hard to compare. They're not even comparable at this point. So
yeah, I mean, it feels as though it could be a little bit of I think it's a harsh weekend to sort of judge Daniel Ricciardo on at this point, because he's had a pretty shocking start to the year, but his pace in qualifying was almost enough to get into Q3, but it makes it even more sort of bitter that it was his teammate that sort of, I suppose, denied him entry into Q3. But if you just sort of look a bit more in depth into that incident he had with Albon, so it was on the run to turn 2, really quite tight part of the track, especially considering that it is towards the start of the lap. But he had Stroll on his left-hand side with more momentum, Albon on his right-hand side with more momentum. It was a case of 3 into 1 didn't go. Lance Stroll came out okay, but Albon and Ricciardo both sort of in the wall by the end of the first. I said by the end of the first lap, by the end of the first few corners. It was really quite the spectacle, and a red flag immediately from that point on, which I think a lot of people just turned off at. It's a red flag, 6 in the morning, can't be bothered with this, you know what I mean? But we'll talk about the man also involved in that incident. We'll talk about Alex Albon, because we are, at this point, we're 4 races into the season. He has, we can start to actually evaluate drivers' performances, as a season goes, and Albon's had a pretty poor start to this season, it has to be said. Another incident, another crash, okay, not necessarily his fault, but a real heart-in-mouth moment for Williams, as it could have been a lot worse, Seb. Explain to everyone, why the chassis is so valuable to Williams at the moment.
I mean, just because they've been crashing so many times. And obviously they came into the season already, a little bit down on parts because they didn't already have a spare chassis, and most teams do. And they were planning to bring that spare chassis by now at China, next race weekend. But with all the crashes they've had, I think Albon's had 2. Sargeant, again, a crash in FP1 as well, so that was it takes out time, it takes money. Basically the one team going into this weekend who couldn't afford to have crashes were Williams. Are they ever going to have a spare chassis this season? I don't know.
Alright, so while it was a bit of an underwhelming weekend, well, to say the least, for Williams, let's talk about a team that were comfortable, I think, in Suzuka. Let's talk about Ferrari, Amy. You were sort of pretty pleased with their performance. What do you make of how they got on in Japan?
Yeah, I mean, they did the best what they could. I mean, they couldn't, after that win in Australia, I think they understood that from straight away in FP1 it was going to be Max going for pole, even though Saturday weren't their day, Sunday was. And they basically did everything they could. Carlos Sainz, it was a bit of friction. There's been a video going around, obviously. Charles Leclerc did incredible on their mediums to only do a 1 stop, and not even to let Lando Norris, who looked pretty decent for most of the race, somehow he was able to stay in P4, and then all of a sudden when his teammate came up behind, team orders said to go and let him pass, and Carlos Sainz ended up in P3, when realistically there was no threat from behind for Charles, and he could have gone and picked that podium spot up himself. But it was pretty comfortable race for Ferrari, being the second fastest team once again all season. Yeah, it would have been interesting if we seen a fight for that podium spot, but ultimately Ferrari did really well, and so far this season they are doing really well with strategy, which is where they've been falling behind recently. Hopefully if they can make improvements to the car and bring some good upgrades, they can catch up to Red Bull, and we may see some fighting for not only podiums but with Red Bull for some wins. So yeah, that is a hope for Ferrari, and I thought Suzuka really showed how well they've started this season, so yeah.
Yeah, once again, the tyres being a big player in Ferrari's weekend. It took a lot of time for Charles to properly get used to them in qualifying, hence why he only sort of finished in P8 and lined up P8 on the grid behind both McLarens, behind Hamilton, behind Alonso, and of course behind his teammate Carlos Sainz, who had an absolute, I wouldn't say masterclass in qualifying, but it was a decent showing from the Spaniard. Still without a drive for next year, so yeah, looking forward to see how that unfolds if he puts in more performances like this. But then once everyone in the race, we saw Ferrari in Bahrain struggling to get the tyres in the right operating window, while everyone else was doing really well with the strategy, and that cost them dearly. But then in Australia, when performance was sort of leveled out a little bit after everyone else was struggling with the tyres, that's when they really thrived, and that's how Charles was able to make those mediums last so long and have the pace around everyone else, in a much sort of more superior way. And of course, Carlos Sainz, delivering with another podium, 100% podium ratio, 100% podium rate this season for Sainz. So yeah, another cracking drive from him this weekend. But we'll talk about the team that they were sort of, pipped to go sort of neck and neck with going into the weekend. Seb, you had a lot of high hopes for McLaren. We'll sort of move on to our predictions later on in the episode. But yeah, just talk about how McLaren, was it an underwhelming weekend for them?
Yeah, it was strange because obviously they were bringing upgrades this weekend and there was a lot of hype around them. And, when it came to qualifying, it looked like they were going to deliver on that hype. Norris with P3, and I was thinking, my predictions we'll look at in a bit. Amazing. Piastri, still, solid P6, not too bad. And actually in the first half of the race as well, they seemed to be okay. Norris was, running in that top 3 for quite a while, and it looked like they would be able to compete for the podium. But as the race went on, I don't know whether it was, tyres or strategy or what, they just couldn't keep up with the Ferraris, and I think that's obviously really promising for Ferrari. But for McLaren, it's there was so much hype for them this season. I know, Amy, you were really hyped about them. That obviously, I think you predicted Norris to win the World Championship. But I also believed it as well. The back end of last year, the step they took last season was massive. It was so significant, and you thought starting a season competing with Ferrari and Mercedes and the teams like that, they'd be able to really push on, but they sort of stagnated. And I think that might be a bit of a worry for the team. I know it's still like a good positions to be fighting in, and that they would, the start of last season you told them they'd be fighting even for P5 or whatever at this time of this season, they're biting your hand off. But I don't know. The upgrades weren't as good as maybe we'd hoped.
Lando said in an interview, the interviewer was like, oh, you're glad where you are now, at the start of the season, you're a lot better than last season. He was like, yeah, but when you looked at Suzuka, they were only 17 seconds. I think it was 17 seconds behind the leader, and now they're 29 seconds, so, I can't do 12 seconds behind. It's a big difference, actually, when you look at it, so... Yeah, like you said, I think they've not actually made the progress they've made, they wanted to make, and Red Bull have just rocketed ahead, so yeah, a bit disappointing.
Well, you say that if you're comparing their pace to the leaders, were you referring to Australia just then, sort of in comparison
to Suzuka last year.
Oh, Suzuka
yeah.
last year, sorry, yeah.
When obviously he was P2 behind, Max, there was still a big lead, but, 12 seconds behind's pretty... I mean, obviously I had drivers in front, but he'd want to be P2 again if you compare him races from, last year. You'd want to definitely be even closer when you're meant to be progressing that car, and they've not progressed it probably as much as they hoped, so...
Yeah, I mean, it just looks as though the drivers both just did as much as they could, really. I mean, it was especially the sort of slower parts of the track that McLaren really wasn't particularly impressive, especially once the tyres started to fall away from them as well. Any sort of, non-high-speed parts of the track, sort of not including the straights, really were pretty difficult. But we did get some excitement. There was an amazing overtake from Lando Norris on Lewis Hamilton going into turn one, just being really committed around the outside, and that's the kind of stuff we like to see from Lando Norris, especially if he does want to try and make that next step and either get the second Red Bull seat for next year, or if McLaren also make a step closer to Red Bull, then it just looks as though it was a drive from Norris that shows his maturity. He is starting to sort of understand his stance in the sport and sort of unlocking the potential that we know he definitely has and has already shown. But we'll move on to the man that I did just allude to, Norris overtaking Mercedes. And Seb, what went wrong? I mean, it wasn't terrible for them, but there was still so much to improve on.
I think this is just their pace. This is where they are at the moment. There's I especially was so hyped for them at the start of the season. It seemed like all the right noise was coming out of the team, but I wasn't surprised that they finished P7 and P9 this weekend. Arguably it could have been worse. And Hamilton wasn't as bad as maybe I thought he was going to be, but still not great. And something I was going to say about Hamilton was, he was the one that suggested Russell could pass him, and I thought that was a bit strange. That's not something someone with a lot of fight in them would do. So I think that maybe adds to the points that we were making a couple of weeks ago, that maybe he doesn't really care about this season, and I think that he's sort of given up. Russell did an okay job, it's just not great for Mercedes at all, really.
I know what you mean. It's not exactly the optimum mindset to have if you are sort of just, conceding pretty quickly and saying, yeah, let him by. But it does show that he's still got that sportsmanship and still got that sort of team player quality. He sacked the team off at the end of the season for Ferrari, despite the fact he's just signed a new contract. But he is, playing by the rules still. He isn't exactly just saying, oh yeah, I'm gone at the end of the season, so I'll do what I want. It is nice of him to be able to, just let Russell by.
It's nice, but nice guys don't win. That's the saying, and I think it's true. I think Hamilton at his best would never have let that. You look at, I know it's ages ago, but 2016 decider in Abu Dhabi. I mean, what he was doing to Rosberg there. I mean, it's a completely different animal at the moment, so I don't think it's a good sign for him to be doing that, but I can understand obviously from a team point of view maybe it does look good, but still that's not the Hamilton I want to see.
I agree completely. This is probably the worst Lewis Hamilton we've ever seen. I mean, I know that's quite a heavy statement, but he has set the standard so high ever since he arrived in the sport. This is a totally different Lewis Hamilton, quite nonchalant, quite sort of just, I don't know. There is that lack of care in any sort of context, whether it's, not caring about his performances, not caring about the team, not caring about the sort of legalities of a contract. It's nothing really going right for Lewis Hamilton. His pace continuing to sort of just diminish a little bit. But I mean, it was a solid weekend from Russell, at least. That's one thing that Mercedes have going for them. Came back well after a pretty sort of underwhelming qualifying session. No incidents this time, especially considering he was in a fight with Fernando Alonso. We'll talk about Alonso now, because he sort of left Suzuka with his head held high. He sort of regarded this as one of his best ever race weekends, which I'd say is a little bit of a stretch, considering that his sort of standard as well is extremely high throughout his career. But it was a good drive from Alonso, certainly back to his best after a questionable sort of display in Australia. doing that thing that Sainz did that helped him win the Singapore Grand Prix last year, keeping Piastri in his DRS so Russell couldn't, get the overtake on Piastri because he had the extra pace. It was just a really smart drive. But while we're on the topic of Mercedes and Aston Martin, that Mercedes engine, that is another thing why Merc aren't doing so well at the moment, because it's pretty poor in a straight line. It's all dependent on how the cars, have their chassis, have their aerodynamics. And so, that Mercedes engine, and it also sort of stretched to Aston Martin as well, because they're a customer, didn't look too great. Amy, what did you make of Alonso and Aston Martin's weekend?
Yeah, I mean, I actually was quite impressed on the Saturday because in Q1 at first I was thinking Max is just going to take this, and he was up there with him in timings, and it was just, again, NET is pretty basic at the minute. With Alonso, it's so easily comparable with Stroll that he's the much better driver, and he probably looks amazing. But Aston Martin, again, just like McLaren, if we look at the start of their year last year, they're nowhere near the same, and they obviously probably want to start on the front foot once again, and they're just nowhere near it. I mean, to finish P6 when your teammates finish in P12, there's a big difference. But I don't think they'd be happy with it, but they look happy with it, and I think that's just showing a bit maybe the aspirations going. I don't know. I feel like that's harsh that they've not got aspirations, because clearly last year they did. But it'd be interesting to see where they can take this car in regards to maybe upgrades. But right now they shouldn't be happy with it.
I know what you mean. It does seem a little bit flat. Something that I think, not to sort of, tip my own hat off to, but I did sort of predict this at the start of the year. They would make a step backwards, and I think everyone is sort of coming to the conclusion that Aston Martin or Mercedes are sort of that 4th or 5th fastest car, sort of quite track dependent, quite dependent on how the drivers are performing themselves in the weekend as well. But Aston Martin, especially if we look at Lance Stroll's drive, he was also in that aforementioned fight for P10, maybe picking home the final points paying position, sort of where the car should be. But then the tyres just gave way, much like everyone else. Suzuka, we said this going into the race weekend, a track that has huge long-lasting effects on the tyres, and strategy is of course all important where degradation is high. But just a fine weekend for Aston Martin, sort of what everyone really expected. Fernando is continuing to drive the wheels off that car, doing a really good job. And maybe alarm bells are going to start ringing for Lance Stroll, because he is nowhere near him in terms of performance. And while he was fighting for P10, sort of where the car should be, Fernando is still doing a much better job. So definitely outperforming his teammate there, but that sort of goes without saying. But we'll move away from Aston Martin now. We'll talk briefly on Haas, because they've sort of generated a lot of talk from this podcast in particular. I think I've been sort of a bit of a Haas fanboy, I'd say. But not a bad weekend. No points this time round. Not much to really write home about, but they did a lot better than I had down in my predictions. I said they'd have a double DNF, but we'll talk more about that all our predictions later. But Seb, anything to make on Haas's weekend?
I mean, it's just, even though they didn't score any points, it's still a really promising weekend, I think, for them. When you look at where they were, how much of a chaotic team they've been in the past 3-4 years, for them to just have to be going under the radar at the start of this season and not having massive talking points about them, and just having solid weekends, getting strategy right, doing the most that they can, getting the most out of their package, I think it's really promising for them. And I think that I'm quietly optimistic about Haas still. I still think surely at some point the bubble bursts, because it's Haas, but maybe it won't this time.
But we'll move on now to Alpine, a bit of a touchy subject for Seb now, because it was just... Oh, you tell him, Seb.
I think it was their worst weekend of the season so far. I know Ocon made it into Q2, that's still in qualifying. I actually do think they are making a step forward. They did bring some upgrades. I don't think they were noticeable at all, because in the race they were awful. Now, they did actually, obviously the two Alpines touched at the start, and Pierre, on his radio the whole race, it was, I've got damage, and he was like absolutely miles off the pack. He was like 20 seconds behind everyone at points. Maybe we can't read too much into that, because obviously Ocon might have had some damage as well, but still, it's just another Alpine weekend. Surely they're going to bring a big upgrade at some point. Please, please Alpine, I need this, otherwise I can't I can't physically watch that Gasly on board every race because it's just so painful.
Yeah, well, you say surely they're going to bring a big upgrade at some point, or it's going to be a good race weekend. The only way is up for Alpine at this point. It is just dire from the Enstone-based team. But I think the less said about them, the better. We'll move on. We'll talk about now. Let's react to our predictions that we made at the start of the weekend. So those of you new to the channel, every single race weekend, we've got a select list of categories that we all make predictions for, such as pole position, the race winner, who finishes on the podium, and many more. Starting off with pole position, Seb and I made the right call and said Max Verstappen. Amy, you want to talk us through your Charles Leclerc prediction?
I mean, I spoke about how, it's a very fast-moving circuit and Charles Leclerc's a very fast-moving driver. So, yeah, I was speaking about, Jules Bianchi. I mean, it's a very important weekend for Charles. He spoke about how, hard he was going to try to be able to get on the top step of the podium. Didn't do that, but he definitely has, I guess, an extra push that weekend, and I genuinely thought Ferrari's looked amazing recently, and why not? And yeah, he actually was awful in qualifying. I mean, not him personally, sorry Charles, but and also the fact he only was able to do one run in Q3. I mean, but Bernie Collins was talking about it on Sky Sports after, and was just like, it's the sort of track where drivers need to get in the mentality of be going round constantly, whether that's in Q1 all the way to Q3. You can't just have one lap, and I don't even understand why they only let him go out once, but not ideal. P8, gosh, that's a lot of sessions, but yeah, P8.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was another just sort of case of him wrestling with the tyres, and it's just, Ferrari and tyres this year, they need to maybe step up the mark in that regard. But, Seb, I mean, there's not really much to say about Max Verstappen's pole lap. It was just routine at this point, wasn't it?
Yeah, I thought Perez was actually a bit better than I thought he was going to be. So, I mean, yeah, he was closer to Max than I thought he would be, considering the sort of the type of circuit it is. I thought Max was going to be miles clear of everyone. It was closer than I thought it was going to be, so hats off to Perez, I guess, for not being as bad as I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, we'll move on now. Actually, no. Before we do that, Perez was, pretty impressive. A lot closer than we thought. I think we'll delve more into that in due course. But not far off his teammate. But it doesn't mean anything really in the grand scheme of things. Another pole position for Max Verstappen. Another good Saturday. We'll move on to our start of qualifying predictions now. So just because Max Verstappen went and got pole position, it doesn't necessarily mean he was the start of qualifying. We like to look all up and down the field and see if anyone sort of performed in the midfield well in qualifying. Now, I said Carlos Sainz, Amy said Charles Leclerc, and Seb said Oscar Piastri. And the point that Seb awarded was my point, I think. Carlos Sainz being the start of qualifying. Where did he end up finishing in the end? It was P4. So yeah, a really decent showing from him in comparison to his teammate Charles as well. And then Piastri, again, nothing to write home about necessarily. P6, solid, but still behind his teammate. So Seb, I mean, do you want to just sort of explain that? Carlos was the only one that sort of qualified ahead of his teammate. Was there anything else? Was it a particularly strong showing from Carlos, or was it just sort of bang average?
I thought it was a decent showing from Sainz. I didn't think it was something that I was like, wow, he is the star of qualifying. But, compared to the other two that we predicted, Leclerc and Piastri, I think it was the obvious choice.
Yeah, okay, well, let's move on then, because there isn't much else to say about that. The flop of qualifying. Now, I'll get this one out of the way. It wasn't Sergio Perez. I did just say that, we'll delve more into it. I had him down as my flop. I think he was just going to be, behind all the cars like Ferrari, McLaren, etc. But no, it was just a decent lap to put in P2, despite the fact that he's not had much luck around Suzuka or pace around Suzuka in the past. Amy, you also agreed with me and said Sergio Perez, and Seb said Nico Hulkenburg. So sort of by process of elimination, Nico Hulkenburg is our flop of qualifying.
It wasn't even a flop though, was it really?
It was really good. It was quite a harsh point for Nico Hulkenburg. Miles ahead of his teammate, P12, solid start. Can't really argue with that. So congratulations, Nico Hulkenburg. You are our flop of qualifying for no real reason. We'll move on to the podium now. So we get 1 point for each correct position, so a possible 3 points to gain from here. Amy, you did score 2 points. Do you want to say which ones you got correct?
Yeah, I went for Max in P1 and Carlos Sainz in P3. didn't pick Sergio Perez in P2 because I chose Charles Leclerc, which shows really my qualifying.
You got to stop backing your boy. You got to stop backing.
I really am. I really have, because I went for pole and start quali Charles Leclerc and my flop Perez, and then the podium was obviously Max, Perez and Sainz. But I'm happy with Sainz. I mean, at the end, even though I wanted Charles to be on the podium, I was a bit like, go on, for the sake of points, please just get ahead of him, Sainz. Just so I could have that P3. Carlos Sainz for me, I mean, 4 out of, well, every race he's competed in, so 3 out of 3 podiums for him now. And yeah, just consistent, so that's why I chose him to, be on the podium. I'm glad he was in P3. So
Seb, talk about your podium prediction, because I can imagine you'll be pretty underwhelmed with what happened in the end.
Yeah, I went for Max P1. Obviously, I was happy with that. It was the obvious choice. But I went for Lando P2 and Piastri P3. Yeah, as I said before, for most of the race, or the first half of the race anyway, I thought that could potentially become true. Not Piastri P3. He was always miles off. But Lando did look like he was in the running for a podium. But yeah, they just, as the race went on, the Ferraris were far clear of them. And I need to stop not putting Perez P2. I think Perez P2, so far this season, he's proven that he is on the ball at the moment. So I think that, yeah, next time, it's a bit of a spoiler, I'm going for Perez P2. But yeah.
Interesting. Spoiling our next predictions episode for the Chinese Grand Prix. You can check out our predictions, by the way, in a video that we will do sort of at the start of every race weekend if you do want to catch them as we reveal them. But yeah, no, you're definitely right about Sergio Perez. While technically sort of, based off results, last season at this point was a better start. I'm pretty sure he'd run away.
He'd won 2 races, I think.
Won 2 races by this point. There we go. Yeah, But even those, so on paper, those results are more impressive. He's doing exactly what Red Bull need him to do, just picking up the pieces after Max. Solid performances. He looks a little better in qualifying in comparison to sort of how last season was on average. But, that wasn't particularly difficult. But, Checo Perez with a decent start to the season and a decent weekend in Japan. I also didn't predict him to finish on the podium. I did say Max would win the race, so I get 1 point there. But then I said Leclerc and Piastri. So I've got to stop back in Amy's boy as well, as it seems. I sort of also got sort of sucked into Seb's hype of McLaren for the weekend. You just spoke with such conviction. I just had to believe it. And of course, Piastri, really strong race weekend around Suzuka last year, and so I just thought the same would happen again. A nice sort of solid P3 finish, really competitive fight for the podium. But no, it was in the end 2 incorrect predictions. But we'll move on to our driver of the day. Now, this is for the Sunday. This is not so if it's whoever the fans vote, then that's the correct answer. But I'm pretty sure. Did anyone vote? Who won the official driver of the day?
Sainz. Leclerc.
Leclerc.
Actually, yeah.
He went from P8 to P4.
Okay, that makes sense.
I know, I should have backed him in the race rather than quali.
Yeah, you've had a bit of a howler this weekend. But so none of us predicted Charles Leclerc. Seb, do you want to just start with yours? Because yours was a bit of a bombshell.
I thought by going for Esteban Ocon, Pierre was going to have a great race, basically. That's why I did it. But no. Esteban, he was not driver today. I think he came 15th in the end. Yeah, he had an okay race. He did the most he could with the Alpine, but he was not driver today. I thought he was going to be, fighting on the edge of the points sort of thing, but no. Yeah,
pretty poor. Then Amy, who did you say?
I said Lando Norris because, like you said, Seb was speaking with such conviction about McLaren that I the whole time I was just backing Ferrari, and I was like, no, McLaren are going to do so good this weekend. So I thought I'd go with Lando Norris, and you know what, at the start, especially when he qualified P3, I was like, there's going to be rain on Sunday and he's going to win the race and it's just going to be what dreams are made of. And then it all fell apart as it got later on in the race, and it was a bit of a flop actually. Still a good race, still good points, but from what expectations were for maybe lap for 30, it should have been a podium finish for Lando, and it weren't. So yeah, not ideal.
Oh, bold, I think, from you there. Maybe a bit of a flop of a weekend. It still wasn't bad from Norris.
No.
P5, solid result in the end, but he did, failed to sort of get past both Ferraris. It was just nothing to write home about for Lando Norris. I said Yuki Tsunoda, and I think sort of signed, sealed, delivered P10, which was, P10 in qualifying, P10 in the race. solid. It was just didn't put a foot wrong. You can't knock it. Home race as well. No mistakes, good pace, much better than, I say much better than his teammate. Impossible to tell, really, because his teammate was gone before the end of lap 1. But I think Seb has given me the point for Yuki Tsunoda there, so thank you very much, Seb. But you are right, Amy. If it had raced on the Sunday, then it could have been a lot different, especially for Lando Norris, who is notoriously good in the wet. But yeah. Yeah,
well, I just think with Yuki Tsunoda as well, is, it's so hard to actually finish in the top 10 at the minute with the top 5 teams, obviously Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes, McLaren and Aston Martin. RB, well, maybe not the team, but Yuki Tsunoda is doing a phenomenal job in that car. 2, points finishes now, getting up there in qualifying to Q3. Time after time, and it's just so impressive. So I think not only has he gone and got a point, that point means a lot, really, because realistically not many cars in the midfield are going to get beating the likes of Ferrari or McLaren, but the fact that he's got in there just shows the sort of driver he is, and he's just so mature now. I just love Yuki Tsunoda. I'm just rooting for 2025 Red Bull seat.
Yeah, he's definitely breathing down the neck of Sergio Perez. So it's a bit of a shame for Yuki that Perez is having this really good start to the season. But yeah, no, really consistent performances. And Perez did reveal that he will find out within a month's time from Helmut Marko if he does have that Red Bull seat for next year. So Yuki's got to keep going. He can't stop yet. He's got to keep carrying on with these solid performances. But we'll move on to our flop of the race now. So someone that definitely, a thing that Yuki Tsunoda won't win. But yeah, who did you say for flop of the race, Seb?
I said Lewis Hamilton, and I was actually tempted to give myself the point for this one because he did have a poor race, and we already went into before about is he lacking motivation and things like that. Yeah, so just not a great weekend for Hamilton. But I think that the one I went for, which was Amy's choice, was probably slightly more of a flop because of the crash he had with. And leads into you, Amy. What did you say?
I said Logan Sargeant, which I know I could say this every week. Probably. It's just like going to start driver of the day, Max Verstappen. But I actually do feel like I deserve this point now because, there weren't much expectation around Sargeant. Me and, Rudy actually spoke about it. There's actually not hype. How could he be a flop? But at the start of the race, he was running in 13th, after the after the red flag. He was getting up there around P10. And then obviously dropped off, and then he also crashed on lap 42, and then luckily was able to reverse and able to carry on. But I think that's a bit of a flop, I can't lie, especially from when he was running quite high up, especially for Williams and himself, and having a worse car probably than everyone else. So yeah, I think that's a bit of a flop for Logan.
Yeah, I mean, the odds were against him. He sort of was dealt a poor hand going into this weekend, running the old spec front wing and, of course, running Albon's chassis that was recently repaired. And, yeah, you can't help but feel that maybe more could have been extracted, considering that his pace, especially, as you mentioned, Amy, sort of in the first phase of the race, was pretty strong. But, in the end, nothing happened for Sargeant. I'll just sort of say my prediction, get it out of the way. I said George Russell to be flop of the race. Didn't happen. It was fine. Not a great qualifying, so I was thinking, yes, maybe this could come true. But he was just fine. Ended up finishing, a solid P7 in the end, I think it was for him. So, ahead of Oscar Piastri as well, so that's fine. There's literally nothing else I can say. He objectively just wasn't the flop of the race. But we'll move back to some sort of more positive predictions now, who the best team was. Now, Seb, you were sort of convinced it'd be McLaren. You were, fighting hard, fighting their corner. But was it McLaren? I don't think so.
It definitely wasn't McLaren. They had a pretty poor Sunday, especially. Okay, Saturday obviously with Norris and P3, but yeah, I don't know why I was so hyped about them. I looked at the results from Suzuka last year and I was like, that wasn't that long ago. Surely, they still have the chances of being the second best team. But I think it shows the big step that Ferrari have made, and that was obviously what you guys went for. And I think. Obviously, other than Red Bull, I think it was Ferrari's best team.
Yeah, no. I mean, I spoke about this a bit before. 3-4 finish, obviously, we're going to be able to get past them Red Bulls. They were in another league. But to be able to get podium, and obviously the second best to a podium's 4th place, especially from starting from P8, is pretty impressive. And, not to be able to have Lando Norris get past them was really... I want to say impressive again, incredible. And for Ferrari, like I said, just a lot better around like the team, I guess, strategy. To be able to risk that with Charles Leclerc, and obviously the Mercedes couldn't do it, and they learned that from early on. I was a bit like, what are they doing? Why aren't they getting them in on a pit stop? And he just managed them tyres incredibly, and so pretty decent weekend for Ferrari, and I would say best team to go. That's why I said it, so yeah.
Yeah, so you and I both picking up the points there for saying Ferrari. They were definitely the second quickest car, and that's what a lot of people were betting against them. They were saying McLaren were going to go and do a much better job, but no, we stuck true with Ferrari. Didn't sort of fall too far into the hype train, but yeah, a point each for myself and Amy there. So no more points scored for our predictions, because our final category is the shock prediction, which is sort of the most illustrious, unpredictable one, I suppose. Now, depending on how shocking your prediction is in terms of shock factor, not shocking in terms of bad, you do get more points based on that, but that doesn't matter. No one got any points for it. I said Haas double DNF, just thought they are overdue a chaotic, typical Haas weekend. That didn't happen. Amy said that Max and Charles would crash into each other, but she'd also said they'd finish 1 and 2, so make of that what you will. And then Seb said Checo Perez to DNF, which of course didn't happen, after he came home with a pretty decent race result and some nice overtakes along the way, using 130R quite nicely to make some decent moves. So at the end of the race weekend, looking at our predictions now, I sit at the top with 19 points, Amy not far behind with 18, and Seb with another underwhelming weekend with 10 points. Seb, have you got any idea as to how you're going to be able to catch up?
I think I'm just going to have to go for star of qualifying, Max Verstappen. Driver today, Max Verstappen. Best team, Red Bull. No. I just need it. I'm going to have to do that, but no, I won't do it. I'll go for something random. I haven't even gone for like outlandish predictions either. It's not like I've said things and it's like, oh yeah, it was funny. He was clearly joking. I've gone for things I actually think is going to happen, and they just don't happen. So
looking Sargeant driver of the day, winner, pole position. You might as well.
Some shock predictions that will get you 20, 30 points. Maybe not 20, 30 points, but a lot of points. I mean, it's still all to play for. We're 4 races in, so I wouldn't.
I've still got hopes of championship dream. So
we're doing a Charles Leclerc, Max Verstappen 22. I reckon really right now we're neck and neck.
Someone's going to have to pull away eventually. Yeah.
Seb, I think that person Seb's going to come in and absolutely storm through. So.
He'll do a McLaren. Oh no, that was the wrong year. Never mind. But yeah, that's enough of our predictions. Now we do them every race weekend, so make sure to check out our channel at the start and at the end of every race weekend to see how much of a mug we make ourselves look. But that is about the end for our Japanese Grand Prix reaction. And we have no race this weekend. We've got Shanghai in 2 weeks. But don't worry, just because there's no race doesn't mean there's going to be no ShefF1 content. Keep an eye out on our YouTube channel because we've got some videos locked and loaded, ready to go for your entertainment. So thank you very much for watching or listening. You can check out our social medias, our Instagram and TikTok, all linked in the description. Thanks for watching. See you later. Goodbye.